Do you ever feel that a certain class of words and concepts are overused and bloated with meaning, such that you never really know what they refer to? Some words, in my opinion, like data or politics or even rhetoric, are meaningless unless you define them within a crystal clear context. One such word is research. We can research internet providers, for example, to find the cheapest options available when we are moving into a new home. In that context, research usually just means Googling until you get too frustrated or bored to keep going. I am quote unquote researching tattoo artists in the area to find someone to do a cute little skull right here that jives with my existing floral line work. Research here basically means me trolling a million Instagram accounts and sometimes strategically DMing. To research in the biomedical fields, on the other hand, you must adhere to strict systematic protocols. The methods or steps are tightly prescribed and prescribed. If you fail to follow some step or adhere to a rule, the results of your research may be useless or invalid. In English studies, we often associate research with poring over dusty tomes, gathering textual evidence from some piece of literature, and reading other folks' opinions and ideas about these texts. We put together all that information and we draw our own conclusions about how to interpret some text, and we write about it in the hopes of persuading readers to buy into our ideas about that book or poem or short story. This is not entirely dissimilar from the kinds of research you might do in professional contexts. However, it's likely that professional research will entail some more hands-on tasks and that it will incorporate some quantitative data more often and more robustly. In this lecture, I discuss research as a professional rather than academic endeavor, but I focus on the kinds of research you will be doing for Project 3. Remember, Project 3 asks you to quote unquote research about a professional writing job or specific field. You will create a detailed, up-to-date summary of 1, the qualifications, the specific duties, responsibilities, and skills of professional writers in a particular area or field, and 2, the qualifications, experiences, and actions that generally lie on a path to employment in this field. To complete that research, you'll do some classic activities like strategic Googling and use of databases. But you're also required to do 2 of 3 specific research activities listed here, and you get to choose which 2 to complete. You can engage in a professional profile analysis on LinkedIn, do a job search analysis using sites like Monster, Indeed, and others, or conduct a professional interview. I've divided this lecture into 2 parts. The first part is primary research with a focus on interviewing as a useful tool for professional contexts. I highly encourage you to choose the interview as one of your 3 research activities for Project 3. This lecture should give you a solid idea of exactly how to plan, structure, and conduct a professional interview. We'll discuss how to analyze interview data in another lecture. In the second part of the lecture, I give some advice on how to get your money's worth out of a database search and point you in the direction of some resources you might use as professional researchers. We learn the distinction between primary and secondary research in elementary school, but it's been a while, so let's review. Primary research happens when you go straight to the original source to get unfiltered information. Secondary research happens when you use someone else's report about a situation, phenomena, or event. Let's say there was some salacious relationship events that happened in your friend group. Friend A cheated on friend B with friend C, and friends D, E, and F want to do some research on the details. To conduct primary research, they would go to friends A, B, and C and ask them directly, as these were the folks on the ground floor of this whole thing. They participated in the shenanigans. They know what went down because they were there. That is primary research. Friends D, E, F asking friends A, B, C. To conduct secondary research would mean that, for example, friend E goes to friend D or F to get the story. They're filtering these accounts through their own language and perspectives, so you're not getting the pure description, but you do have a version of it. For a less gossipy example, an author of a biography on Frederick Douglass, for example, does primary research when they go to the archives to look at Douglass's letters and original writings, or to see newspaper clippings that discuss his activities. You do secondary research on Frederick Douglass when you read a biography that author eventually wrote. Interviewing is one of the easiest ways to conduct primary research. It allows you to save time digging around looking for answers by just asking specific targeted questions to individuals who may have that information. Often, companies will conduct interviews with customers or folks of a certain demographic that they'd like to court as potential customers in order to understand what they're looking for out of a product or service, or figure out problems or issues they are having with existing products and services. In some cases, technical writers need to interview experts in order to best understand how some procedure or product works so they can write about it. Interviewing can also be useful and straight up interesting for your personal life as well. True story. After my grandmother was brutally murdered in 2004, don't worry, her killer is in jail now, I started interviewing my family about her simply to learn more about this person I barely knew. Y'all, I found out some insane dirt on her. We're talking days of our lives level shit here. Hop into my Zoom office hours one day if you want to hear about some of this, or look for my forthcoming book on the subject in like 2045. The point is, I would not have found out any of this had I not gone to the primary sources and done some interviewing. It's a really cool skill to have. So let's talk about how to best conduct interviews and get the information you need. There are 3 main kinds of interviews you can conduct. On one end of the spectrum is highly structured interviews, like a census, where each person you interview answers the exact same questions with the exact same phrasing every time. On the opposite end of the interviewing spectrum are those with little to no structure, kind of like the ones I did with my family members, in which I had a few general questions written down, but I just let the experience flow wherever the interviewee wanted to take it. I had no strict plan, and I let the person I was talking to be in the driver's seat. Semi-structured interviews are the best for most research, and are what I would recommend for the interview you might do for Project 3. In these, you have a clear plan for the interview, a point A where you'd like to start, and a point B where you'd like to get to by the end of the session. While you have an ordered list of questions that build on one another to help you uncover the most pertinent information, you allow for some serendipity in the moment. As you listen to the interviewee's responses, you stay there and ask follow-up questions that may deviate from your original plan, but you always remain in the driver's seat, directing the interviewee back to your pre-planned questions so you can get the interview information you need. My friend Ben is an anthropologist, and he works at State Farm, and he likens the kind of interviewing that this is to a road trip. For example, the interstate is your main questions. It will get you from point A to point B, but you are allowed to take scenic routes by going off onto little unplanned excursions. To conduct a semi-structured interview, you need to design a set of questions that best prompt the answers you want. To guide your interview design, first articulate your overall research topic, goals, and your major research questions. Next, you think about the specific interview questions. What themes do you want to bring up? Articulating those themes will help you determine your specific questions. So for example, if your topic of research was personal finance, you would still want to articulate a goal and then a question around that. Your goal might be to understand how college students think about money, and so your research question is formulated based on your goal. How do undergrads think about money? Next, you might pull up some themes around the concept of money and the way you manage it, such as what was your upbringing like and how did that contribute to your own thought process about money? also your household financial situation, the extent to which you are employed, also your budgeting experience. This gives you the main ideas around which you might structure different sets of questions. Another thing to keep in mind as you're designing the interview questions is to start off the interview with very broad and general questions so that you can invite conversation quickly and easily and help the interviewee ease into the process. As you move through the questions, they can become more specific. If you need to ask sensitive questions, make sure those are closer to the end of the list so that you have some time to build trust. Perhaps the hardest part of designing an interview is actually writing the questions. This next section will be important for your success on the homework this week, so be sure to come back to it. You will practice writing interview questions and then write an analysis of why you made certain choices. This advice is where I'd like you to concentrate your attention. First, when writing questions, always avoid the yes or no format. The aim is to draw as much information out of the interview as possible. Focus on who, what, where, why, when, and how questions so that the interviewee must respond narratively, or at least must respond with lots of details. So, for example, you ought to ask, what's your experience with budgeting rather than do you have a budget? This one elicits a short and nondescript answer, whereas this one draws a lot of information out of them. Similarly, instead of asking, do you hate your job, which not only is a leading question, which we'll talk about in the second part, but it also only allows for a yes or no question answer, whereas how do you feel about your job gives them a lot of examples to express themselves. Next, phrase your questions in a way that's neutral so you don't sway the responses one way or the other or set the wrong tone. You do not want to plant ideas into the interviewee, but facilitate their sharing their truth with you. And you also don't want to offend or alarm them. So, for example, you should rather say, tell me a bit about how you grew up versus what was your family's socioeconomic status growing up. This forces them to focus on a kind of rich-poor dichotomy, whereas this one allows them to narrate something to you that will give you the clues that you need to interpret it in the way that makes sense for your project, but it doesn't prime them to give you one specific answer. I think another situation in which you might practice this is, what ethical considerations, if any, do you bring to your work? That could be considered somewhat leading, but it's better than, in what way are you contributing to evil in our society? Think about the kinds of people, probably myself included, who might be doing interviews with billionaire leaders of corporations, for example. It's better to ask something a little bit more neutrally than it is to be more direct and confrontational. Furthermore, write questions in a way that the majority of the population will understand, unless it's a specialized interview. So you ought to say something like, what sorts of things are you doing to prepare for retirement, as opposed to, what are your perceptions of a traditional IRA versus a Roth IRA? It might be that they know this, but it's less likely if you're asking a layperson that they know this terminology. Lastly, be ready to deviate from your interview questions during the actual interview. The semi-structured interview should be designed for you to ask follow-up questions to explore things that come up unexpectedly. Although it's tough to do in the moment, try to follow those same guidelines when coming up with these follow-up questions. Avoid yes or no, use neutral phrasing, and use plain language. Once you have your interview questions, you'll have to actually conduct the interview. Here are some tips for optimizing that process. First, you should project confidence. Often folks can feel anxious when meeting someone in person and speaking to them without really knowing them very well. The good news is this isn't just a random conversation at a party where you're in the dark about the flow. You designed the interview after all. So you should have a great idea about how it will go. As the interviewer, you are in charge. Feel at liberty to change directions, redirect answers, and more. If you're feeling nervous, consider practicing the interview with a friend. Finally, you fake it till you make it. Put a confident front if you have to. My friend Ben, the anthropologist from State Farm, says that he used to be an intractable introvert, and was terrified to have conversations with folks in any situations, social or professional. However, after practicing interviewing for his job over and over and over again, he gained more confidence that allowed him to be more natural, inquisitive, and talkative in non work spaces. As someone who is an intractable extrovert, I cannot relate, as I cannot stop talking or asking questions ever in any context. Another thing to do is to pay attention to your body language during interviews. Make sure that you always face your participant and appear open. Avoid crossing your arms across your chest. Instead, keep your arms at your side or on your pen, paper, or laptop to invite the interviewee to really share with you. You lean forward slightly to demonstrate your interest and engagement. Make eye contact and acknowledge what you hear the participant saying with head nods and maybe some verbal mm-hmm. Finally, make sure that you wear clothes that are appropriate for the environment. Interviewing a CEO in their office might mean dressing differently than interviewing a mechanic. You don't want to show up over or underdressed in any situation. Interviewing over Zoom is similar to other in-person interviews, except you don't have to worry about the bottom half of your outfit. I highly recommend doing Zoom or in-person interviews because you're able to ask follow-up questions that get way more information than if you just send a static set of questions over email. But if the person is unable to take the time, that's fine. Emailing will work as well. Use the techniques we discussed in Lecture 3 to compose an email that politely invites the person to answer questions and that expresses your gratitude for their taking time. Another thing to do when interviewing is considering how you will take notes. The best case scenario is that you will ask and receive permission to use a recording device in order to record the interview. Never record in secret. You must get permission to do this. But even if you do have permission to record, you need to make some notes as the interview is happening to both remember details for later and to formulate follow-up questions. This might be the hardest part of interviewing, the multitasking necessary to drive the conversation while also taking notes. But you'll need to do this in order to remember the high points of what the person says. Beforehand, you can practice shorthand, create abbreviations, and prepare to be content with recording incomplete thoughts. While handwritten notes might be less disruptive than bringing a computer, it's not unheard of to use a laptop to type during the conversation. The next piece of advice might sound optional, but it's imperative to make some brief notes immediately after the interview. At that point, it's incredibly fresh in your mind. You should immediately write up a summary of what you heard or learned. Keep it informal. This summary is just for you. Some of the things you might write are answering questions like, what are your main takeaways, main learnings, what surprised you, and what do you still have questions about? We'll end the video now and move to a second video to talk more specifically about secondary research in the professional context.